my name is Natalie and this is my presentation on Ghrelin for HBS 204. So what is Ghrelin? Well, Ghrelin was only discovered in 1999. In its active form, it's a 28 amino acid peptide. It's mostly secreted by specialized enteroendocrine cells in the stomach, although there is some secretion by cells in the small intestine and some tissues outside of the GI tract, such as tissues in the hypothalamus, the placenta, and the pancreatic islet cells. In the main, Ghrelin is secreted in response to fasting. This has earned it its moniker as the hunger hormone. Plasma concentration levels of Ghrelin increase prior to eating and tend to initiate the eating response. They stimulate the appetite, and they decrease once the body is in a fed state. In this overview diagram, we can see that the initial stimulus for Ghrelin secretion would appear to be an empty stomach, where the stomach is not distended. Ghrelin is released by the stomach, and this stimulates hunger by influencing centers in the hypothalamus that regulate appetite control and feeding behavior by stimulating the secretion of neuropeptide Y, shown here as NPY, by the hypothalamus, which is a neurotransmitter and stimulus for food intake. Locally in the stomach, Ghrelin acts as a paracrine hormone modulating the GI hormones that control gastric emptying and motility. The maintenance of energy homeostasis is dependent on the balance between energy intake and expenditure. Once mechanoreceptors in the stomach are stretched, secretion of Ghrelin ceases and secretion of leptin by adipose tissue, indicating satiety, commences. Interestingly, the receptors for the opposing forces of Ghrelin and leptin promoting this energy homeostasis are located on the same cells in the hypothalamus. Ghrelin is not only responsible for increasing appetite, it stimulates release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. This diagram indicates both the starvation and growth pathways of Ghrelin. As we saw in the previous slide, Ghrelin stimulates food uptake, helping to maintain energy homeostasis. But it also acts on the hypothalamus and directly on the anterior pituitary to increase the secretion of growth hormone. This is known as the growth pathway and is different to the starvation pathway, which is all about increasing appetite and stimulating appetite. In the growth pathway, we'll discuss this in more detail when we discuss later on how Ghrelin interacts with other systems in the body. So how exactly does Ghrelin exert its effects? Well, once Ghrelin is released, only its active form can bind to receptors. Ghrelin receptors are G protein-coupled receptors, which are the most numerous and well-known receptors in the human body. These are located in the cell membrane of growth hormone secretagogue receptors located in the brain, also known as GHSR receptors. By binding to these receptors, Ghrelin initiates the cellular response by increasing intracellular calcium release. From there, this increased intracellular calcium leads to the phosphorylation of AMP-activated protein kinase, also known as AMPK. By using this intracellular second messenger, Ghrelin is able to effect a cellular response of the secretion of various hormones, such as the growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone itself, and neurotransmitter NPY mentioned earlier. So there are a number of factors that increase or decrease circulating Ghrelin levels. As we mentioned earlier, Ghrelin is the hunger hormone. So once the body is in a fed state, we have increased blood glucose levels. This in turn leads to increased insulin levels to take that glucose out of the blood and to store it as glycogen. So with food consumption leading to increased blood glucose levels and increased insulin secretion levels, the Ghrelin circulation will be decreased. Somatostatin, which is the antagonist to growth hormone releasing hormone, also will increase while ghrelin decreases. So ghrelin circulating concentration is increased when there are increased levels of growth hormone releasing hormone, when there is short-term fasting, as it then stimulates the hunger reflex, when there's a low body mass index, and also when thyroxine, which is a thyroid gland hormone, is secreted, and this increases metabolism, blood pressure, and regulates tissue growth. So we can see the short-term starvation or food restriction leads to an increase in ghrelin blood concentration. And ghrelin levels are higher during the night because often at night, it's been about 5 or 6 hours since we've eaten, the stomach is not distended, and as we saw in the earlier slides, this is one of the stimulants for secretion of ghrelin, which leads to secretion of growth hormone, which allows for tissue repair and growth during sleep cycle. You can see that ghrelin is tied in with a lot of other different hormones within the body, as is the way with all the endocrine system. They do not act independent of one another. So let's just have a quick look at the relationship between ghrelin and the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So as we mentioned earlier, during periods of fasting, growth hormone is high. It promotes protein synthesis to allow crystal growth. It mobilizes fats in the adipose tissue and breaks down stored glycerols into fatty acids, which can be used for fuel. It also decreases glucose uptake rate by inhibiting insulin and therefore conserves glucose. In the liver, it promotes glycogen breakdown to increase blood glucose levels. So growth hormone levels are highest during the first few hours of sleep. Ghrelin levels, mentioned earlier, also are highest at night, so it's likely that this helps stimulate the growth hormone cascade by stimulating the release of growth hormone releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Of course, ghrelin also has an effect on the pancreatic hormone. It has an inhibitory effect on insulin release. Plasma ghrelin levels increase during fasting, and this decreases glucose uptake by inhibiting insulin, so therefore it conserves glucose. In obese individuals, there may be a reduction in circulating ghrelin levels, and they also therefore may have an excess of circulating insulin, which is called hyperinsulinemia. So we've seen this before in obese individuals. They have a lot of secretion of insulin, which decreases insulin sensitivity. So ghrelin may play a role in that. Prader-Willi syndrome is a condition where a disease state where ghrelin function is altered. It is a rare genetic disorder. Usually presents in infancy in hypotonia, which is floppy muscles, lack of a suckling reflex. It can lead to developmental delays and mental retardation, behavioural disorders. There are characteristic physical attributes such as the facial appearance, short stature, and it can lead to obesity. Obesity and the behavioural problems are the major causes of morbidity and mortality in Prader-Willi syndrome and are the most recognised symptoms. It does lead to a condition called hyperphagia, which is the excessive intake of food to absolutely abnormal levels. There appears to be no off switch in Prader-Willi syndrome sufferers. They have an insatiable appetite. Usually this presents itself between 1 to 6 years of age and can result in hoarding of food, eating food that is totally inappropriate, such as pet food or frozen food, eating food out of the bins that's spoilt or rotten, stealing of food or money to buy food, and often you'll find that parents of children with Prader-Willi syndrome have to put locks on pantries and refrigerators just to stop this excessive eating of food. There have been a number of studies of the role of ghrelin in Prader-Willi syndrome. A couple are mentioned here. Hark and Associates found that excessive levels of ghrelin in young Prader-Willi syndrome may be a response to failure to thrive or food restriction in infancy. As we know, ghrelin is secreted when we're in a fasting state. Children, when they first present with this as babies, cannot feed because of hypotonia, so they are in a chronic and persistent fasting state. This can eventually lead to hyperphagia, which is excessive overeating, and that can lead to progressive weight gain. Parigi and associates found that ghrelin induced excessive fat storage and weight gain by increasing food intake and decreasing fat utilization in rodents. The effect was independent of the ghrelin's role in stimulating growth hormone secretion. And they also found that fasting plasma concentrations of ghrelin were higher in people with Prader-Willi syndrome compared with the healthy control group. So excessive ghrelin secretion has a physiological effect on the body. It increases appetite to disproportionate levels. Ghrelin levels should fall after a meal in a healthy individual. In Prader-Willi syndrome sufferers, they don't get this fall in ghrelin levels. They are always hungry. Similarly, as we saw earlier, ghrelin acts locally to increase stomach motility, so that also can lead to obesity because their stomach is always empty, and that will lead to more ghrelin being secreted. So far, treatment has been restricted to recombinant human growth hormone, and this further supports evidence that while ghrelin has a role in stimulating appetite, this role is independent of its stimulation of growth hormone secretion, as growth hormone deficiency is one of the symptoms of Prader-Willi syndrome. As yet, the role of ghrelin in this syndrome has not been firmly established, although plasma levels are generally higher in individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome, so they would seem to be linked. Further research obviously needs to be done in this area to see if there's a direct link. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you learned something from it, and thank you for your time.